So with the state of play now behind us, we do have at least one major release to look forward to from Sony, even though it's very clear there was another game they were trying hard to push. I mean, Astro Bot seems to have taken over online coming out of that event, and to me, looking at sort of the landscape of Sony as well as just game development in general, something like Astro Bot, to me, feels like something that Sony really needed. And it's not even necessarily coming from the business side, as we'll talk about that, more so from the gamer's perspective here. But I wanted to go over all of that and sort of put my thoughts out there here today. So if you guys enjoy this video, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you're new. So that recent state of play has drawn criticism and praise. Criticism around just about everything other than Astro Bot, but really something that took up about 30%, that's right, an entire third of the show, was Concord. And it has not gone over well online. It does look like their knockoff Overwatch with a sprinkle of Guardians of the Galaxy thrown in there, and it looks like something that, yeah, they probably pitched 5 years ago, like Firewalk, and they eventually came out with it now, as it is at least releasing in August. So it's not super far off from the grand official reveal, but I gotta admit, even going into it, I wasn't expecting a 5v5 hero shooter that really does look like Sony wanted to have their own Overwatch game. But nonetheless, it's gotten downvoted into oblivion online, and for the most part, the majority of people are just not happy with the direction of Concord here. And it's another live service game from Sony. They had great success with Helldivers 2, and this might be one that maybe doesn't land, we'll say, quite the same. But as we started out the showcase with Concord, on the opposite end of the spectrum, they closed out the show with Astro Bot, and this has drawn universal praise for the most part. If you look at the like to dislike ratio with this one versus Concord, it is night and day. I mean, Astro has like a 99.5% like to dislike, and people are looking at this extremely happy because it does feel like kind of old school Sony to a degree, but it also feels very different from a lot of stuff we'd expect from Sony recently. But I will say, at this time, PlayStation is like the healthiest they've ever been. In fact, they proved this with numbers during their business segment, which we can see that here. And this is very telling. So it is the most profitable generation for Sony to date, as they demonstrated here, and they go all the way back to the original PlayStation with sales as well as operating income, which is basically their take-home for the most part, right? And they show it throughout the entirety of the generation. They also show how badly the PlayStation 3 generation hurt them, where they lost $4 billion for that, despite bringing in $71 billion in gross revenue. And then you can see with the PlayStation 4, they profited $9 billion versus $107 billion that they brought in. And I mean, Sony has typically, their margins aren't necessarily great with the gaming sector, especially when you see the amount of money they bring in versus how much they actually get when you subtract all the different expenses and other things for it. But right now with the PlayStation 5, specifically this generation, I'm going to say not just the PS5, which I'll touch on here in a second, but in general, since the PS5 came out, they've accrued $106 billion in revenue, which just about matches all the PlayStation 4's life, and it's already been able to eclipse that operating income of $9 billion with $10 billion. Now, you can see just from sort of the little bar chart they have here that they definitely benefited in terms of operating income from everything that happened with the pandemic, where people are inside, they're returning to different forms of entertainment like video games that maybe they wouldn't normally pursue as much when they go outside or they commute to work and that sort of thing, right? Well, in this case, Sony clearly was able to extract more money because of that, and it's kind of leveled off a bit more now, but nonetheless, $10 billion in operating income, that's very impressive for them, and clearly they're doing something right with the PS5, go figure. The other thing, though, that they're not necessarily mentioning here is the extended cross-generation period, to the point now where the PS5 is finally overtaking the PS4, has also benefited them, because typically when you get to a position where you have a larger install size and you start releasing consistent software to go along with that, yeah, you're going to make a good bit of money, like actual operating income profit from that, because you're not necessarily selling as many consoles, which tend to cost quite a bit. You're selling a bunch of software that will make you money on the back end, right? That's the idea of subsidizing these consoles at a lower price and maybe even taking a loss on it, is you'll make it up in the long run by selling them software every single year. So the fact that they haven't had to deal with very unique hardware, we'll say, whether it's the Emotion Engine chip or the cell processor, it's been x86 of the PS4, x86 with the PS5, even sticking with AMD basically the whole way, right? It's been an easier transition for them in terms of revenue versus operating income. So now we see Sony looking around and realizing that development costs are getting high. Right? We saw that leaked information from Insomniac with Spider-Man and $300 million for that game. There's a Marvel license, of course, attached to it. But then you also look at things in-house from Sony with The Last of Us Part 2 or Horizon costing more than $220 or right around $220 million. That was years ago. Like, these costs are going up and up and up every single year. So to me, when I see something like Astro Bot show up at this State of Play, and then I kind of look at the timeline of events with Team Asobi, this feels like something that Sony should really get behind and push much more than even Concord, which it seemed like they went into that State of Play thinking Concord would be the big discussion coming out of it and the thing people were looking towards. A lot of people were looking at Astro Bot, and again, they closed out the State of Play, so they at least have an idea of it being relevant, but it almost feels like they saw it as kind of how they did with Helldivers 2 originally, and that blew up. I think there is serious potential for Astro Bot to have a big jumping off point here for the franchise, which it's been around for a while, actually, beginning of PS4 era? It's been a bit, though. But this is the first time, at least that I could think of, where Astro Bot's been out there and people are really looking at it as, oh, wow, this could be a PlayStation mascot. Kind of has been a little bit under the radar, but this seems like a moment in time where Astro Bot can really take off. And I look at this game and go, Astro's Playroom came out less than 4 years ago. Remember, it launched with the PS5, and many people should be aware of Astro because it's on everyone's PS5 when you get it. It's a pack-in game. And the fact that it appears to be coming out, right? It's going to come out less than 4 years after Astro's Playroom came out. That's a pretty good turnaround, right? Obviously, they're using assets and other things from Astro's Playroom, but still, this is a release cadence that I think people are looking for to match up with what they're bragging about, really, which is their operating income being higher than ever. See, it's one thing to be a shareholder or be really excited about Sony making a bunch of money. It's another thing to go, okay, how does that then translate into a release cadence that makes sense, right, for the gamer? Because we figure, all right, well, you're making a bunch of money. This is then going to turn into entertainment and games for me, the person who has the PlayStation 5. And seeing a release like Astro Bot, I think lines up much more so with that expectation. The fact that Naughty Dog, Sucker Punch, Sony Santa Monica, we're going to make a big push for just the PlayStation 5 console, right? Because, God of War Ragnarok, good game, was also on the PS4. And I think that's what people are looking for right now, is that big release from one of these big time studios within Sony to really go, okay, that's why the PS5 is relevant. That's why I picked this up for that PlayStation Studios release. But the reality is, games take so long to make that if you do have a stumble like Naughty Dog, where The Last of Us Online just got canceled outright, you see how it's like, oh wow, it feels like they are missing, there's a hole in their release schedule, and that was probably it. So now it's like, okay, well, is this next IP from Naughty Dog that apparently is brand new, is that going to hit? Because we've seen how if a project releases and it just does not hit the mark, it can sink different studios. I don't think it would sink Naughty Dog if this new IP came out and it just didn't do as well as maybe Sony was hoping, but it does make you think about the direction of, sure, PlayStation and PlayStation Studios, but also just gaming in general and having to figure out these longer dev cycles and the amount of money it takes to release just one game. See, I do think there's a place for these really big AAA narrative-driven experiences, but I feel like it's something that should coexist with some of these smaller titles, which, yes, Astro Bot is technically a quote-unquote smaller game, probably in the sense of scope and budget, even though Team Asobi has already mentioned in recent interviews that this Astro Bot game is like a big game for them. I understand that. it's not going to cost, I would assume, hundreds of millions of dollars like the next Spider-Man game will, or like the next Last of Us title, or new intellectual property with Naughty Dog, or Ghost of Tsushima 2, right? It's not something that's going to happen. But because it maybe costs 20% of those games, expectations will be lower, and there's a chance that if this really catches on and it does well in terms of sales, 5, maybe 10 million or so, you never know. We saw what happened with Helldivers 2, where that absolutely exploded, where there weren't those kind of expectations. Astro Bot could actually make a run here, and I think that'd be really exciting if it happened. And that's the big reason why I think this is exactly what Sony needs, are these supplementary titles that fit in to try to fill in the gaps for what are 7-8 year development cycles for these different games. But also, I'm just really excited for Astro Bot. It's very contrasting to what we're used to with Sony, which very narrative-driven experiences, as they say, and the tone tends to be darker and more serious. Then here's Astro Bot that looks like, in the most basic sense, a video game, right? Like it looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. It looks very bright and colorful and happy for the most part. It's like, hey, let's just go play a good 3D platforming game without having to get super invested with morals and decisions. That I'm looking forward to. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm also curious how Sony is going to price this game, because, I mean, there are going to be a lot of people who wonder if it is a $70 game. Is it worth that amount of money? Well, I mean, for me, if it's just a good game, then yeah, it would be. And it seems like it is going to be a larger 3D platforming game with like 80 levels and 6 galaxies, so yeah, I'm on board, but we'll see how Sony handles that, as we'll have pre-orders going live here in like a week or two. But let me know what you guys think about all of this down below, and kind of the direction of Sony. Do you think games like Astro Bot to go alongside of their big AAA narrative experience is exactly what they need? Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.